Hey everyone, welcome back to another Meet Kevin Report. We are on episode number 70. It is no longer April 1st, which is good news because it means Donald Trump is not actually suing me. But we do have some updates to knock out of the park regarding not only Donald Trump, but we'll talk about that sticky left tail, that recessionary risk. We'll talk about the evolving credit crisis, and we'll also look at some of the economic catalysts coming up. I'd like to do that on Sundays. Gives us a little bit of a look at really the week ahead and some of the dates that we want to be paying attention to really over the next couple of weeks. So we'll go through all of this together. So anyway, happy Sunday. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. So first, why don't we knock out the big Donnie T issue? So we'll start with Donnie T, and then we'll jump on over there to the next topics. All right, Donald Trump. All right, here we go. Well, Donald Trump is back at it again. One of the first things the attorneys for Donald Trump are expected to do is try to move the trial for Donald Trump in this indictment that we're expecting to be unsealed on Tuesday to Staten Island. Now, there's an obvious reason for this, and it is because Staten Island tends to lean Republican. In fact, if you zoom in onto New York and you look at Staten Island specifically, which is kind of interesting because most of the properties that Trump owns are actually in Manhattan, not Staten Island. But anyway, if you zoom in and look at Staten Island, you'll find that about 57% of the voting base is Republican. Exactly 56.9% of people voted for Trump in 2020 in Staten Island. 42% voted Democratic. Now, this is a clear difference because that means Staten Island leans conservative. Well, guess which direction New York City leans? It should be obvious. It leans left. But how left does it lean? Well, in 2020, Joe Biden got 76% of the vote in Manhattan. Donald Trump only got 23% of the vote in Manhattan. In 2016, Hillary Clinton won 79% compared to Trump's just 18%. So he actually improved his overall voting base by 2020, but still ended up losing by a significant margin in New York City. Now, we do expect some outcomes of this. First of all, for moving this case to Staten Island, we think there's probably a next to 0% chance that the case will actually be moved to Staten Island. It doesn't seem like there would be a reason for moving it, especially since Donald Trump's most of his connections are to Manhattan, and some could allege that the actual crime occurred in the district of Manhattan, perhaps while Donald Trump was residing at Trump Tower. TBD. But what we know is that we expect the indictment against Donald Trump with potentially as many as 32 different charges to be unsealed against Donald Trump on Tuesday. Of course, many of these charges are likely to weigh evidence on these hush money payments potentially paid or not paid to Stormy Daniels and the litigation around that. Now, Donald Trump, at least according to this, it was actually a pretty good piece, and we know the New York Times does not like Trump, and we know Donald Trump rags on the New York Times all the time. But just for the sake of naming sources, this morning the New York Times had a cover page article, and they were talking about how Donald Trump has this tactic of basically delay everything as much as possible. And really, that's where I'm going to leave that piece because I don't want to go so deep into that one. What I think is very interesting about that is Donald Trump's legal strategy is, hey, look, sue all you want. But what I'm going to do in the meantime is I'm going to use that lawsuit as ammunition for my fundraising, which is actually, to some extent, is quite brilliant. I mean, if you have very politically divisive lawsuits against you, why not just delay every potential progression of those lawsuits? And everything you can do at every point in turn, try to get more media coverage to it. I mean, think about it this way. I just covered Donald Trump potentially wanting to motion to move his lawsuit to Staten Island. Obviously, that's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. But you know what's really interesting is it's another thing that gets people talking about Donald Trump. And it's brilliant. This is sort of the principle, which is outlined in some of his books, including Art of the Deal, which technically he co-authored. But there's this concept I don't think he uses this particular phrase. It's been a while since I've looked at these. But there's this concept of chaos theory, especially in litigation. And it really is, how much can you do to just make the other side's life a living hell? And you pepper them from every angle possible. And this is exactly what happens when you poke Donald Trump to some extent. Look, you poke Donald Trump with the threat of this indictment happening. What happens? Donald Trump comes out and turns it into a massive political rallying cry, ends up getting Congress involved, sending letters to the district attorney, to which now the district attorney has to basically take time from what they're doing and actually respond to all of this, which Congress, obviously, at least the three representatives who put this letter together, are like, well, I mean, we have the right to oversight. This is part of your duty anyway. Don't tell us you're wasting time responding to us. You are obligated to respond to us. Okay, fine. But the point is, it's brilliant. I mean, now you've got the biggest security possible around the district attorney's office. The New York Police Department is expecting to shut down most of the streets around where this indictment and the arraignment will be held, as well as the booking process. We do not expect Donald Trump to be in handcuffs. Honestly, from a publicity point of view, it would probably look a lot like closed streets, some angry people outside of the closed streets, Donald Trump almost like going to a doctor's office, like checking in and checking back out. And so I kind of think the arraignment on Tuesday will probably be a relative nothing burger, because it'll be, here comes Donald Trump's motorcade. Then he walks into a building, and an hour later he walks out. There's no jail, no handcuffs. It's almost going to be like a business appointment. But the chaos that Donald Trump creates around the district attorney's office is his playbook. That's exactly the playbook, is how can we distract you in every way? How can we politically rail, which he's already doing, on the judge, on the district attorney, on everybody involved? How can we get people to hate those people? How can we get people to basically egg those people's houses or cost them? And how can we increase law enforcement presence in the area, and then use all of this as a fundraising tactic? Again, I don't actually think Donald Trump thinks there's a chance in hell this case is actually going to get moved to Staten Island. But what does it do? Is it says, hey, please move the case to Staten Island. Now everybody covers it. Oh my gosh, Donald Trump is trying to get the case moved to Staten Island. And people look at Staten Island and go, oh, Staten Island's so conservative. Wow, Manhattan really is liberal. Wow, 76% Biden, 79% Hillary. Damn, is this going to be a fair trial? You see what like he's doing? Like literally, it's. I mean, I always try to be neutral, but I can't help but look at some of the pure brilliance, dare I say, sometimes, of these moves, because really, by suggesting, hey, let's move it to Staten Island, he's really highlighting to the world how liberal New York City actually is. And in doing that, he can basically say, look, hey, Republicans, if you want me to have a chance in this election, you're going to have to send some more dollar hollers over, because this is going to be a hard fight. You can't blame it. It's a brilliant strategy. And every day he pulls off something like this. It's a fantastic way of his campaign getting more attention and more donations coming his way. So, very interestingly, on Tuesday, again, we do expect those streets to be closed around where the arraignment is to be held. Tuesday, tentatively, Donald Trump is expected to check in around 2 p.m. And I understand that some of this, makes people frustrated. They don't like hearing about politics or Trump, but it's very, very important, because the economy responds to what happens in politics. Remember that Goldman Sachs believes the Inflation Reduction Act, rather than being deficit negative, is actually probably going to expand the deficit substantially more than expected. The spending of the Inflation Reduction Act is likely to be 3 times as great, and the actual deficit reduction portions are actually likely to be smaller than expected, again, via Goldman Sachs. And this shows you just really an Inflation Reduction Act is really likely going to end up being inflationary, as stimulus checks are essentially being delivered to the energy sector. And then you've got the $80 billion CHIPS Act, which is probably also likely to cost maybe twice or 3 times as much, via the similar principles, cost overruns for manufacturing plants being built or whatever, and then basically companies begging the government for more money, and they're getting it. So politics really does matter when it comes to finances and where we want to invest. This is why I think chips and energy stocks have substantial pricing power right now. But anyway, all of this Donald Trump entertainment, dare I say, should probably encourage you to get life insurance. Get life insurance in as little as 5 minutes. It's super easy to do. You just go to metkevin.com/life, and you will go from not having life insurance to having life insurance. Literally, before you're even done watching this video, you could probably be done signing up for it, and then you could tell your family and everyone, "Hey, look, finally got it. I finally did it. I finally checked it off the list." Of course, this video is brought to you by StreamYard. So shout out to StreamYard. Thank you so much to them. metkevin.com/StreamYard, and check out those programs on building your wealth. Link down below. StreamYard and the insurance, of course, a paid promotion. So with that said, look, obviously Tuesday is going to be, I think there's an expectation that Tuesday is going to be very entertaining, but I'm not holding expectations out that it is going to be vastly entertaining. That we're going to see massive protests. That we're somehow going to see some form of hustle or some sort of, like, how should I say, tussle, I guess is the word I was looking for, between Donald Trump and law enforcement. I really think it'll be like checking in for a doctor's appointment. It'll be actually kind of boring. The most important issue that'll come out on Tuesday will be what are the actual charges and potentially the evidence. So that gives us an update on what's going on with Donnie T. All right. So, hey, Kevin, when do you think the nation's debt is going to be an issue? And when do we need to reduce it? $1 trillion coin isn't going to happen. But really, look, the debt crisis, the debt ceiling will get expanded again. Really, the time to pay off the debt is an expansionary period of time, although that can be very tenuous. So I think what's most important right now is getting the economy back to a state of actual stability. So we've got some time to go before I think there'll be talk about deficit reduction at some point in the next 50 years. I think it'll become quite important. Uh, what is this? A viral picture of 5 countries making new currency. I haven't heard of this. Oh, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa are working together to create their own currency. Oh, that's quite interesting. Let's see here. Let's see. I'm looking for a source we can look at. I'll give you my reaction. All right. Let's see here. Okay, how many paywalls are we going to hit to try to get a story that we can actually look at? This is ridiculous. All right. All right, here we go. Let's see what this story is. Okay, that's pretty short. All right, I'll give you a reaction to it. Let me mark this. Let's go with currency. All right. And we're going to present. Stand by. We're going to start with this, but I'd like to get a Bloomberg piece. Hold on. Give me a sec. If I can get another source here, I think it'll be quite useful. Let me see here. Just take another second here just to respond. Actually, not even being covered there. That's fascinating. Yeah, there's not a lot of mainstream media attention on that right now. That's interesting. Okay. All right, let's go take a look at it. A commenter just asked me what I think about the fact that 5 countries are potentially now working on creating their own currency. Those countries are Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. There's a piece here that we can take a peek at in Cointelegraph. Mainstream media, surprisingly, is not covering this, at least not yet. So let's take a peek at what we've got here. We've got this story that we want to cover, and let's see where, there we go. There we can show it. All right, so let's see what we've got. We've got a new world order could be emerging as an economic power, or as economic powerhouses increase their efforts to distance themselves from the US hegemony. Ooh, remember, hegemony is a regional power. According to reports, a top Russian official has claimed that the BRICS alliance is working on creating its own currency. Okay, let me stop right there. This is my first time reading through this, but let me stop right there. First of all, the BRICS, You're talking about relatively small economies, with the exception of China here, but India has a substantial potential of being a relatively large player in the future. But let's add these together so we can do this at the same time. But in the meantime, my initial reaction to this is probably uh, Russian propaganda. I hate to say it, but it's probably Russian propaganda. And if this is coming just from Russia, it's not going to be, in my opinion, that credible. It's entirely possible that in the past, maybe in 2019, 2021, maybe there was this idea that, oh, hey, we should all get together and create a currency. Okay, maybe, but I don't think this is coming up now. I think the financial stability risks are too high right now, and there's too much tenuousness right now to actually care about creating some kind of new currency now. So I wouldn't be surprised if this is sort of a revived idea of when these countries maybe had officials together and like, hey, we should make our own currency. Yeah, 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 yeah. That's a good idea. I think people immediately get very nervous about this idea of, oh my gosh, what's that going to mean for the United States? The reality is nothing. Like this has been done many times before. I mean, consider when the euro was created. Did that really change anything? No. If anything, some people say the euro helped create the European crisis and actually reduced growth in Europe because they had a combined currency and you no longer had central banks in individual countries which could respond. I mean, consider what happened with Europe. The euro really went into prominence, somewhere around 2003. And you had a massive austerity crisis around 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14. I mean, there wasn't even enough money to pay for trash service in Greece. Why was that? Well, it was because Germany was progressing so well and their economy was holding up so strongly that the entire Eurozone was actually lifted up by Germany. And so the Eurozone thought, okay, well, let's put a lid on Germany. Let's lower the strength of the strong countries, Germany, France, right? And now, if we put a lid on them and they have austerity, well, crap, we are also essentially implementing austerity to all of the other countries. But then when you look at what is derogatorily called the pigs, Portugal, Italy, Greece, Spain, these are the highly indebted countries, at least were. When you look at these countries, you look and go, wait, why are they supposed to go through austerity? They need stimulus, not austerity. And so what ended up happening was not only massive protests, but really a fear that the euro was going to collapse. So, if anything, people believe that this experiment of the euro and sort of a common currency was actually a greater mistake because it didn't give you that freedom to basically print and trade and swap, like liquidity swap, so to speak, as freely as banks would like to create more of a market equilibrium. The more you try to engineer currency, oftentimes the less functional it ends up becoming, and that was really seen in Europe substantially. And then growth fell so much in Europe, whether that's causation or correlation is to be argued and debated. But growth fell so much in Europe that you ended up with negative interest rates at the end of the decade. So right before the pandemic, right? But I mean, look at the countries that you're talking about here that are listed together. First of all, Russia's like a joke in terms of economic size. They act like they're equal to the United States, but their economy is somewhere around the size of Brazil's. And it's probably substantially weaker today, given that I'm going to give you Russia's economic strength as of 2021 was about 1.77 trillion dollars. Honestly, that's probably down somewhere around 20%. They're probably around a 1.5 trillion dollar economy. That's a fraction compared to the U.S. GDP. And look, even though we talk about recession might be a reduction of what, maybe 0.5% or something. So we're still sitting in excess of $23 trillion of an economy. That makes our economy 15 times as large as Russia's, 15 times as large as Brazil's, which is part of this. You know how many times larger we are compared to South Africa? 55 times. Yes, China might hold a candle to us, but China has its own problems. Fortunately, China isn't seeing inflation because they're not actually seeing this massive worker shortage. In fact, there are a lot of people with not enough money in China. So you're definitely still developing in many regards in China. India is still somewhere around 1/8 the size, 1/7 to 1/8 the size of we are. And yes, they're growing. And yes, they have the potential of growing stronger. But when you consider Europe and the size of these economies, am I really terribly concerned that, oh, they might form some new currency? Who gives a crap? It really isn't going to make a difference. So I think a lot of this is probably just unnecessary fear mongering that occurs. And quite frankly, I made a video the other day because a lot of people now are talking about this idea of, oh my gosh, the dollar is going to lose its reserve status of a currency because it's going to no longer be used as the petrodollar. Please just type into YouTube, Meet Kevin, United States dollar, China. Type that in and watch my video, The Collapse of the Dollar, the End of America, and the Rise of China. And when you go through the video, I think you'll realize this whole petrodollar and dollar crisis disaster is A, historically something that's always been going on, and B, not that big of a deal. Not that big of a deal at all. It's unlikely anytime in the near future, especially before oil, in my opinion, becomes a lot less functional in our economy. But also, this is quite silly. Mexico joining as well. Who cares? Like it doesn't matter. It really. And then you have to also ask yourself. So first of all, we went through Europe, then we went through petrodollar. Now you have to ask yourself, who cares if they make their own joint currency? If anything, it's going to just cause the euro problems. But even if somehow they had their own currency, big deal. Okay, fantastic. Like, congratulations, you have your own currency. Does that all of a sudden make your economy a lot stronger? No. Is there an idea that, well, maybe people will want to buy this new currency's debt and maybe there'll be a central bank to moderate all of these countries? Now you have to ask yourself, do you really think China wants to lose control over the Bank of China and basically relinquish monetary control to a shared voice with South Africa, Brazil, Russia, India, and maybe Mexico? Of course not. It doesn't make any sense. Like from a logical point of view, it makes little sense. And then from a practical point of view, it makes little sense as well because of the euro crisis. But then, I mean, even the African states were considering creating a currency called the Afro. Look it up. That's not a joke. After the euro's creation, there was a thought that African countries would get together and create the Afro. It ended up falling apart, and it was never launched. But it really ultimately, like, okay, go have your common currency. Does it really make that big of a difference? No. The entire currency is still going to be underwritten by the strength of the underlying economies. And even if in aggregate, somehow that common currency has a larger underlying economy than the United States, is the trust of that the same as the US dollar? No, and it won't be for a very long period of time because you still have to underrate the risk of Russia going bankrupt and maybe 10% of your bonds becoming worthless with this combined brick currency, right? So you still have to underwrite. It's like there's this famous, I don't know what that saying, if there's a saying to it, but there's this famous idea on Wall Street that when you take two mediocre companies, or even two, you can even go as far as saying take two good companies and merge them, you end up with one mediocre company. Usually, mergers are not a good thing. You lose the innovativeness that originally came, and I think a lot of that would be true here as well. So to me, it's just once again just a bunch of nonsense and hogwash. But we'll look at it anyway. According to reports, a top Russian official, again, the fact that Russia is claiming this is just a complete nonsense. But anyway, and I'm not saying this is not potentially something that could happen at some point in the future, but I mean, again, I think I made my argument. Made the comments at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum event in India, whatever, reportedly stressed the importance of both nations working together towards a new medium of payments. Well, do keep in mind, a new medium of payments is different, or potentially different. I mean, I suppose you could have some kind of currency system, but what you are seeing is this move away from SWIFT to some extent. China has its own banking messaging system and platform called CIPS, SIPS, and that's been going on for years. I mean, the larger these economies go, of course, there's going to be competition to banking systems, but that's okay. That to some extent is also healthy. It keeps the United States innovating as well, right? When you're in the lead in a race and somebody's catching up to you, you start running faster. He also said the currency could benefit from China and other BRIC members, not just the West. Right? I doubt that. The composition should not be based on inducting new monetary ties and establishing a strategy that does not defend the user, but rather forms a new currency, blah, 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 shared objectives. Yeah, y'all just want to grow. That's fine. Russia would probably love this because then they'd have some currency stability. That's the other thing you have to keep in mind is if the source of this is Russia, there's probably a reason the mainstream media isn't covering it because it's probably just Russian propaganda. Because Russia would love a stable ruble. The ruble's down like 20%. It's not good for their economy. So they would love to, tie their anchor to other countries. I mean, Russia is essentially devastating their economy. Really, I mean, you have to consider that the individual who was arrested who worked for the Wall Street Journal. Let's see, Russia economy. That was his, the last piece the Wall Street Journal reporter made before he was arrested in Russia, in Moscow, I believe it was the following, and I think it's also worth looking at because it just gives you a little bit more of insight into how much should we really actually care about this Russian propaganda, really. And there we go. Let's throw up the coupon code while we're at it. That will, by the way, the price for that will be going up on April 12th. So that's in about 10 days. That's when CPI occurs. Anyway, so what do we have here? Let's see. There, I can expand it a little bit. Good. The opening months of Russia's invasion into Ukraine last year drove an increase in oil and natural gas prices that brought a windfall for Moscow. Those days are over. As the war continues into its second year and Western sanctions bite harder, Russia's government revenue is being squeezed and its economy has shifted to a lower growth trajectory, likely for the long term. See, of course, Russia's lashing out, and the idea is let's all create a currency together with countries that aren't falling apart like Russia. The country's biggest exports, gas and oil, have lost major customers. Government finances are strained. The ruble was down over 20% since November against the dollar. The labor force has shrunk as young people are sent to the front, the war front, that is, or flee the country over fears of being drafted. A lot of Russians, by the way, fleeing to Finland, which Finland is a potential NATO member. There's a train, or I'm not sure if it's operational anymore. I believe that goes from St. Petersburg directly to Finland, like a nonstop kind of train. Uncertainty has curbed business investment. Yeah, no kidding. Could you imagine being a business in Russia right now? You just want to survive. Could you imagine trying to expand right now? Russia's economy is entering into a long term regression. That's even worse than recession. There's no sign the economic difficulties are bad enough to propose a short term threat to Russia's ability to wage war. In other words, don't think the war is going to end because of this. But state revenue shortfalls suggest an intensifying dilemma over how to reconcile ballooning military expenditures with the subsidies and social spending that have helped Vladimir Putin shield civilians from hardship. In other words, at some point, you're going to inflate away the value of your currency. Russian billionaire blah 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 warned this month that Russia is running out of cash. There will be no money next year. We need foreign investors. Look at this. So you have a Russian billionaire and raw materials guy, commodities kind of guy, which the commodities just are not surging the way people thought they would. People thought as soon as China reopened, commodities would surge. It's just not happening right now. But now, what do we have this out of this here? Well, we have this indication that look, you basically have a Wall Street Journal reporter who quoted a Russian billionaire saying Russia is running out of money and we need money, we need help. And immediately after this, gets arrested. Evan over here. This was his last piece before he got arrested. I mean, basically the day after the story published, he was in handcuffs and in prison. The fact that he made Moscow a second home was mind blowing to me. But then again, that's probably how he actually got the content for his stories. So I suppose it cuts both ways. But anyway, having largely lost its European market next door and with other investors pulling out, Moscow is becoming ever more resilient on China. See, look at this. They want that. I'm telling you, what's the phrase? I think there's a relationship phrase, hitch the wagon. Moscow is trying to hitch their wagon on China because they're falling apart, threatening to realize long simmering fears in Moscow of becoming an economic colony of its dominant southern neighbor. Despite Russia's resilience in the short term, the long term picture is bleak. Moscow will be much more inward looking and overly dependent on China. Said a senior fellow think tank in London. Big part of the diminishing outlook stems from a bad bet by Putin last year that he could use Russian energy supplies to limit Western Europe's support for Ukraine. Oops. European governments, instead of tempering their support for Kyiv, moved rapidly to find new sources of natural gas and oil. What we really ought to do is build more nuclear power plants. That's a phenomenal energy source, but people are weenie babies about that because, no, I don't want a power plant in my backyard. I mean, I get that. I wouldn't live next to a nuclear power plant either. So, I mean, I can't blame that. But you got to build them somewhere. Most Russian gas flows to Europe have stopped after initial jump. Global gas prices have fallen sharply. Moscow now says it will cut oil production. You know what's funny, and it shows you how worthless Moscow's attempts to control the oil market are. It seems like anytime oil says or Moscow says they're going to cut oil production, oil prices do nothing. In other words, I think Moscow thinks that the oil prices, are going to surge after they say, "Well, we'll cut production," and everybody's just like, "Whatever." That's Russia being Russia. I really think that's almost how this brick currency piece is being understood. It's just, quite frankly, it's Russia being Russia. It's not that big of a deal. Now, what is a big deal though, as we continue with this story here, is the fact that you can get life insurance in as little as 5 minutes by going to metkevin.com/life. And take a look at this StreamYard, which is the platform that I use to bring you my daily content every single day for over the last 2 years. I've been using StreamYard to help me produce content and live stream to you. They are now a sponsor of the channel, so you can go to metkevin.com/StreamYard, learn more about them. It costs you nothing to use my link. Of course, paid promotions here. It costs you nothing to use my link, but it would be a way of saying thank you to the content you get here. So take a look at StreamYard. Anyway, let's keep going. As a result, the government's energy revenue fell by nearly half in the first 2 months of this year compared to last year, with a budget deficit deepening. The fiscal gap hit of 34 billion in the first 2 months, the equivalent of more than 1.5% of the country's total economic output, is forcing Moscow to dip into its sovereign wealth fund. Basically, they're liquidating money just to stay alive, right? Now, we're not going to read this all word for word, but I think the obvious impact here is we are we're looking at Russia that's essentially lashing out over the fact that their oil revenues are drying up. Here you can see on the left side, oil and gas revenues drying up. Their federal budget is negative. Retail trade is also under its 100 base index, so you're down about 6-7% over here. Fall in exports, tight labor market has increased government spending and worsening inflation risks. Russia's inflation was around 11% in February compared with February of last year. So look, I mean, you've got issues. You've got where that Russian billionaire who was interviewed was dreaming of competing with Elon Musk's SpaceX. Yeah, oops. Well, and this goes sort of into a little bit more background on the billionaire here. So, but I think the point is this idea about this BRICS currency or whatever, man, bring it on. But really, I mean, learn the lesson, study the euro if you want to be. And look, w- I'm really simplifying this. I spent years studying the collapse of the euro because that was a lot of what I had to write papers on in college. I studied economics, accounting, political science at UCLA, corporate finance, all these things. And the euro was such a big subject at the time because while I was going to school, the crisis was occurring, and we even visited Europe and studied it there. Uh, of course, I was also born in Germany, so visiting Europe is really fun. But yeah, I think this is just nonsense. I mean, I appreciate it coming up, and I think it's good to talk about. But really, if somebody's going to big heaven, the BRICS are going to replace the U.S. dollar. Stop worrying about it. If anything, I think it's just good ammunition for. Quite frankly, it doesn't surprise me that a lot of crypto papers are talking about it because the more fear there is that the dollar is going to lose its strength and that other countries are going to create their own currency, the first thing that happens is people start going, "Well, this means crypto gonna go up." Oh, well, yeah, to some extent, that is kind of what happens. Now, one of the neat things about Bitcoin is that it's actually been resting on 28,200 ish, which is a pretty important threshold here. So we'll see if BTC can hold. But after we realize how much manipulation there potentially is from Binance, it makes me a little nervous. But that's not to say I'm not a big fan of it longer term. What blockchain could bring us. I think I've said for years, big fan of blockchain technology. Not so much of a fan of the order books yet and the order flows. I think they're still too easy to manipulate. So anyway, that is my thought on this BRICS question. Again, I appreciate you bringing it up. I think it's wonderful. I think you even donated money here to bring that question up. It was fantastic. So hopefully this was useful to you. What is this? 247 years ago, the founders of the U.S. rebelled against the theft of money taxation by the Central Bank of England. 137 years later, the same owners of that stole back. Look, I think we've made our case here, we don't need to go through some of the arguments again here. But this is an interesting one though. Here, this comment here from Ronald: trust in central bank hasn't worked out for the average person. It's destined to fail. Well, see, I would question where you are evaluating what people's trust is in central banks. And quite frankly, if you look at inflation expectations from the consumer, it certainly appears as though the consumer is not as terribly worried about the dollar as anybody in the finance community seems to be. It also seems like the average consumer doesn't actually feel like they're in a recession, given that they're mostly spending through this recession. It seems like most people are just going on about their lives as usual, mostly because they probably built up enough financial strength during COVID that they can. So good for them. But anyway, that is the end of our bricks segment and fun. All right, let's hit another topic here. Let's do some economic catalysts, eh? All right. Okie dokie here. All right, we got a few. Stand by for the economic catalysts. Stand by. Go. We need Morgan Freeman to help us. Stand by. Well, over the next 2 weeks, we have a lot of catalysts coming up. Let's talk about exactly what dates you should be paying attention to. We'll specifically take a look at jobs, a CPI. Let's look at some pre and early projections for some of these numbers. If they're out, we've got a JOLTS report coming out. Let's see what some of the surveys are for this. Let's go through all of this. Do keep in mind that on April 4th, we will really be starting another earnings season. So April 4th, stay tuned. We're going to be looking at some of the small companies. There's really nothing too big on April 4th just yet, but we're going to get Simply Good Foods. We'll get some steel reporting on the 5th. On the 6th, which is next Thursday, in terms of reporting, we'll get WD-40, Levi Strauss. I like looking at those kinds of companies to see where the consumers' heads are and where inflation is. More interestingly, will probably be on the 11th. We'll get CarMax, Albertsons. Are we still seeing those food prices move up? How about those used car prices? How are they affecting margins? Because it seems like used car prices are falling, but wholesale prices are actually rising. So dealers are potentially looking at negative numbers. You've got Rent the Runway on the 12th. You've got Delta Airlines, Progressive, Fastenal on the 13th. Then on the 18th is actually when you start getting the banks reporting. That's when things are really going to get entertaining, especially since they're going to show us the numbers for the banking crisis. We'll have a lot of banking commentary between the 18th and the 20th. We'll get Bank of America, Johnson Johnson, Goldman Sachs, Bank of New York Mellon. Those will report on Tuesday. Johnson and Johnson will be very interesting in terms of evaluating industrial inflation. How's that wage price spiral? Again, that's the 18th. Then, of course, we get our leading tech company. We get Netflix also on the 18th. On the 19th, then we get into like the Morgan Stanleys, the Citizens Financial, IBM, Zions Bank, American Express on Thursday with DR Horton and Nokia, as well as Blackstone and Associated Bank Corp. So we'll be getting a lot of financial information really the week of the 18th. I think more interesting for next week is going to be the jobs report. So really, probably for the next week, we're going to be mostly or we'll mostly be putting earnings on the table and paying a little less attention to earnings for next week. It'll be more fascinating to see what happens with jobs. So let's take a look at what we've got on the 3rd, which is tomorrow. We'll get ISM manufacturing and prices paid surveys. Survey suggests that prices paid will come down slightly to 51.1. That is still in the expansionary territory, but down from 51.3 in the prior. We'll get some commentary on ISM employment. Remember, this is the Institute for Supply Side Management. This is really sort of what comes before consumer price inflation, right? We'll get manufacturing PMIs on Monday morning as well. Those are the manufacturing purchase manager indice numbers, expecting slight contraction there at 49.3. Construction spending is expected to be flat month over month. On the 4th, we'll get factory orders, expecting those to be down 0.5%. We'll also on the 4th be getting the JOLTS, that is the job openings and labor turnover survey. That number has consistently been above 10 million. It has regularly surprised to the upside. The last release was at about 10.824 million. The next survey is for a 10.5 handle. I'd write that one down. That'll be on the 4th, 10.5. Stocks likely to move on the JOLTS. And of course, if we get a big move on ISM prices paid to the upside, there could be some downside risk in stocks. On the 5th, we'll be getting the S&P Services PMI, Purchases Managers Index. That'll be very important because obviously most folks expect that inflation is stickiest in the service sector. That is expected to come in at a match for the prior release of last month. So February and March expected to match at 53.8. That is, again, the same as the prior release. Then on the 5th, we'll also be getting the ISM prices paid. This is the services prices paid. So on Monday, we get ISM manufacturing prices paid. And on Tuesday, we'll get ISM services prices paid. No forecast yet for that. On Thursday, the 6th, we will be getting continuing jobless claims. We're expecting those to come in at 200,000. They've regularly been at about 200,000 for new claims. And continuing claims, the prior release sat at about 1.689 million for continued unemployed individuals. That number shrank last time a little bit. We'll see how it comes out this month. Then, and before we keep going down this list here, obviously, I should always remind you that on the 12th, prices will be going up for the lifetime access on the courses on building your wealth. Check that out, link down below, or go to metkevin.com/join. You can also just go to meetkevin.com and you'll see sort of everything that you can learn about whether it's house hack, life insurance. You can get in as little as 5 minutes at metkevin.com/life. 12 free stocks with Webull at metkevin.com/free. Of course, these paid promotions. This being brought to you by StreamYard, metkevin.com/StreamYard to learn how I bring these videos to you. So check all those links out down below. We're going to meetkevin.com to learn more, where you can also learn about my ETF. Okay, so then we've got on the 7th, we're going to be looking at that change in non-farm payroll. This is our jobs report. We should be getting ADP on Wednesday. Let me look at ADP first. ADP is expecting, that's the private version of the jobs report. We're looking at about a 210,000 expectation, down from 242,000 jobs. That's Wednesday for the ADP report. And then Friday, we'll be getting the change in non-farm payroll. That is looking like 240 is the survey. The last payroll report brought us in at 311,000. We now expect to sit at 240,000. So nice sort of shrinkage in that jobs growth, obviously coming off those crazy numbers we had in January, probably heavily due to seasonal adjustments where we were sitting around 500,000 job gains. However, we will also be very closely looking at average hourly earnings. Average hourly earnings in the prior release came in at 0.2%. The survey now says 0.3%. That is a little bit of a bump up to an annualized rate of 3.6% for average hourly earnings. It's a little aggressive. We'd like to see that come in soft. Then, of course, the next data set that we'll really be waiting for is the CPI report. We do have some surveys for CPI. First, though, on the 10th, we'll be getting a wholesale trade month over month. We don't yet have a survey for that, and we'll be getting wholesale inventories. No survey for that either. That'll be on the 10th. On the 11th, we'll get small business optimism, and then there we go. It is April 12th. April 12th, by the way, is also a day we'll be getting the FOMC meeting minutes. So what is the forecast for CPI month over month for March? Keep in mind that March will have a lot of funky expectations given we had a banking crisis and potentially reduced spending during the banking crisis. CPI month over month in March for the data release on April 12th is looking like it's expected to be down from the prior report of 0.4% month over month to 0.3%. That would be good. 0.5%, it was the prior release for core month over month. That's expected to shrink to 0.4%. However, the year over year number, not clear yet. The prior release was 6%. No survey on that yet. However, year-over-year core could potentially accelerate from 5.5% to 5.6%. That wouldn't be great. The next day, on the 13th, we'll also be getting PPI numbers. We do not yet have surveys for those, with the exception of month-over-month final demand. Producer price inflation expected to be flat at 0%. So those are the catalysts for the next 2 weeks. Obviously, the most important are going to be jobs. So you should mark your calendar for the following things. Okay, these are the things I would be marking my calendar for. April 4th, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, JOLTS report. April 7th, 5:30 a.m. I will be live streaming the Meet Kevin report at that time. You're welcome to join. 5:30 a.m. on the 7th, jobs. Then I would write down April 12th, expiration of Meet Kevin's coupon code for the amazing programs with lifetime access on building your wealth, specifically the bundle for 0 to millionaire real estate investing and stocks and psychology of money, which comes with my trade alerts as well. Then CPI, obviously you want to write that down. That's on the 12th at 5:30 a.m. on the 12th of April. So those are some of the catalysts that we're really going to be paying attention to over the next 2 weeks here. Those are going to be quite critical. And right after these catalysts, we'll actually be going into banking earnings. And understandably so, there'll be a lot of curiosity in terms of, okay, how are things getting affected through banking earnings? So we'll be paying heavy attention to banking earnings. So stay tuned for that. But this gives you a catalyst breakdown of what to expect over the next 2 weeks. If any of those catalysts make you nervous, get life insurance in as little as 5 minutes. Remember, Lauren and I use it. It is so easy to Apple Pay for it. I always remember people like, oh, you should have life insurance. I'm like, no problem. Boop, boop, Apple Pay. MetKevin.com/life, and you can get it. It's so great. Even SoFi uses it. Think about that as a pitch. SoFi recommends the same company as MetKevin.com/life. So it just goes to show they're a phenomenal, phenomenal partner. Big, big, big fan of working with them, and I'm a customer of theirs as well. Just like I'm a customer of StreamYard, which is what's bringing you this video today. MetKevin.com/StreamYard. All right, next up. Kevin is my MF man, but your thoughts are going against the heads of entire 5 countries. Fantastic points nonetheless. Man, these 5 countries can suck it. Just kidding. No, I mean, look, obviously these countries are going to be big players over the next decades. I would not bet against China, but I'm not going to bet on China either. I'm going to bet on America. I'm going to bet on American PP. That's what I want. I don't want Chinese PP. I want American PP. I think American pricing power is much larger. All right. Next. Okay. So next, we've actually got. Ooh, this should be pretty interesting. So the next piece that I'd like to cover is the sticky left tail. Yeah. All right, let's talk about our left tail risk. Stand by for the left tail. If you don't know what that means, don't worry, I will explain. Okay, so I need Goldman Sachs. Let me just organize this really quickly. Goldman Sachs. Then we need, it's The Economist. I have Goldman Sachs, The Economist. That's the credit crunch thesis. We're not doing any Morgan Stanleys here. No. Huh, okay. Oh, are we doing Citi in this? Citi. No, that'll be in the next one. Okay. Oh, this will be easy then. It'll be a nice little short one, but it'll be good. Okay, good. Okie dokie. Oh yeah. All right, this one's cool. Okay, I'm going to start out of order on this one, but I think it's a very great piece. Oh, the banking crisis. Right. Okay. All right, here we go. So next up, we are going to talk banking crisis and left tail risk. Yeah, okay. In this video, we need to talk about the banking crisis. Not only do we need to talk about the banking crisis and how things are actually unfolding, but what I'd like to do is look at what The Economist tells us about left tail risks, along with Goldman Sachs. Now, left tail risks are lack of growth risks. Think about it like a bell curve, okay? If in the middle we're growing steady, if on the far right we are hyperinflating and things are basically taking off in such a way that we have to get Paul Volcker. The left tail risk is really that, we have damaged the economy too much. The Federal Reserve has gone too far in hiking, and we are going to be in a dirty and deep and dark recession. Well, in this segment, we've got two important pieces to cover. One, I'm going to give you the economist's conclusion on whether or not we are going to face a deep, dark, and dirty recession. The Economist, by the way, one of my favorite publications, and I think they are very, very good. Just know if you read The Economist, they don't like Donald Trump and they lean left, but they have very, very good economic insight anyway. And notice you can still like people who have different political opinions than you. That's very important. But first, let's look at Goldman Sachs, because Goldman Sachs has some neat look, or a neat look, should I say, into exactly what's going on with the banking crisis. Goldman Sachs obviously is massive financial partner. It's one of the biggest 10 banks that we have in the country. It's also a huge financial partner for Apple. They back the Apple credit card, so they're getting a lot of data on consumers. So when Goldman Sachs tends to give us some insights, I like to pay attention, although I don't take everything at face value of what these individuals like to say, because they can be wrong. But then again, everybody can. So, but it's good to look at perspective. So, speaking of perspective, let's hop into it right now. There we go. And let's throw up the coupon code. There we go. Okay, fantastic. So first, let's start here on the banking crisis, and then we'll talk left tail risk. So this segment was very interesting. They say here, further signs of stabilization in the banking system. Although money market funds continued to see largely institutional inflows, the pace declined by about roughly half of that seen in the prior week. Now, we've talked about this before, this idea that the banking crisis is stabilizing. You're actually seeing small bank deposits level out. In other words, these were small bank deposits, then they fell, and now you're kind of getting this leveling of small bank deposits. It really feels like the banking crisis has slowed or come to a halt. Goldman Sachs here tells us that even the pace of money market movements has slowed. We've talked about this yesterday about how discount window borrowing at the Fed has also slowed, and that really the Fed's lending to bridge banks via the Bank Term Funding Program, in other words, by the Fed pivot. Although I don't really think that's the Fed pivot, it was just really a tool that they deployed. Is also stable. And what they talk about here is really this idea that last week we were talking about how this scramble for dollars had gone global. Remember when I came to you from a ski resort talking about how the Fed was injecting liquidity via new daily liquidity swap operations on a Sunday? Though we expected it would be one off. In other words, they're really saying, look, we had this sort of one off crisis where everybody was freaking out. But so far, every indication of struggles is waning. The demand for the dollar is waning internationally. This is not to be confused with the petrodollar. Okay, I'm talking emergency lending dollars. This is different topic. Okay, we can talk about the disappearance of the dollar in a different video. People keep bringing that up, but it's just not that important right now. So discount window borrowing, bank term funding facility, money market movement, small bank movement, and a dollar movement, all relatively stable. This is actually phenomenal insight, right? We want to pay attention to stability in the banking crisis. And so really the question then is, okay, well, how is the banking crisis really going to affect us? So let's see here. North America, United States, yield response to near term news potentially asymmetric. Our baseline view is that credit tightening resulting from the current banking turmoil should be contained. Listen to this. So many people are saying that's it. Our economy is going to go into a deep, dark recession because, oh my gosh, what about all of the credit tightening? Oh my gosh, Kevin, quickly change the banner to the paid promotion on life insurance, metkevin.com/life, because everything's going to hell. The reality is no. The reality, frankly, is no. The banking crisis is not that big of a deal. I was having actually a slight debate about this yesterday. Somebody was asking me, but Kevin, like big banks, they're going to be forced to lend less. And I'm like, How many times have you gone to a big bank for a loan in real estate? And if you're not familiar with going to big banks for loans, you know that you don't go to big banks for loans. You usually go to smaller banks for loans. And then there's the thought, oh, but they're going to regulate smaller banks more, right? No. Guess what the Biden administration just talked about? They talked about how we're not going to punish the big banks because they've already been punished. Well, then we're going to punish the small, right? No, because that's not fair to the small banks. So whom are we going to punish then? Let's punish the medium banks. I kid you not. You can't make this stuff up. The Biden administration now wants to punish the medium-sized banks and tighten lending standards at medium-sized banks. And I believe what this is going to do is basically turn the medium-sized banks, the more closer to systemically important banks, that 250 mil bill threshold rather, and you're going to see the medium banks become more regulated like the larger banks. So we don't have another Silicon Valley Bank, which basically just means the smaller banks are going to be like, we just had a lot of deposit outflows. You know what that means? We're going to have to get more creative to bring customers back. How about better mortgages, business loans? You want rental property lines of credit again? What could we come up with to bring customers back? They will come up with an endless suite of lending products. And I believe you already know this, so this I don't want to sound redundant. You already know that I am of the belief that we are in a Nike swoosh style recovery that we now I believe are in the beginning of what will likely be a 10-year bull run, my opinion. But guess what I think is going to add fuel to the fire of that bull run? It is none other than small bank lending taking off to support a return of deposits to small banks, and they're going to do that by enticing you with cheap loans and beautiful, sexy loans, beautiful, curvy, delicious loans that you can't get anywhere else, and we'll be tempted by those and drawn in by these delicious loans, and we'll just have to go back to the small banks and re-engage relationships. And then you know what the small banks are going to do? They're going to say, hey, look, we know you have concerns about the FDIC limits of 250K, but you know what? Look, we have made a menu for you. If you open up this account and this account and this account and this account and this account, we could get you up to $3 million of FDIC coverage. Just have multiple different business accounts and multiple different LLC accounts and multiple different accounts of this, and all of your deposits will be protected. In fact, if I was a small bank right now, that's exactly what I would be doing. If I was a small bank, I'd be thinking about exactly how I'm going to milk FDIC for everything it's worth. I would start LLC formation within my bank, and I would be like, dude, let's just create another LLC, and then you're going to put 250 into that subsidiary and 250 into that subsidiary of your business. And guess what? We'll basically make it easy and seamless for you to always be FDIC insured. In the meantime, you want some sweet, sexy, delicious loans because guess what? The big and medium banks ain't going to be able to provide for you, but we can. I'm telling you, it's like the game is just hilarious. I strongly believe in it, and I actually think it's a good thing because it'll contribute to a bull market. And yes, is risky financing risky? Absolutely. But worst case scenario, small non-systemically important banks go kaput, and who really cares? And the people who bank at those banks will be enticed to be at those banks under the promise of FDIC insurance. And then guess who's really going to pay for the small banks taking risk? The medium and big banks once again. It's corporate socialism, folks. So the banking crisis really isn't that bad. But anyway, well, listen to this. The credit tightening will likely not be large enough to push the economy into recession or force the Fed to ease aggressively to the extent markets appear to be anticipating, even in a probability weighted sense. Why do they talk like this? They talk so complicatedly. Basically, they're saying, yo, credit crisis ain't going to be at bad. Don't worry. People are overblowing credit crisis. That's all they needed to say. But I'll go back to their words. Even in a you know what? It's hoity-toity. Even in a probability-weighted sense, where we ascribe increased odds to a recessionary outcome, we believe yields have declined too much. Who writes this trash? This is basically saying people have fled to bonds. Despite this, we do not think fading this pricing via duration shorts is particularly attractive in the short term. In other words, don't even though we don't think that even though we think that bonds are going to fall and rates are going to go up, it's probably not a good idea to short. So even though we say this, don't bet on it. By contrast, restoring full confidence and assessing the impact of diminished credit provisioning could take time. This is something we do hear about as well. the lag that it takes to actually get any kind of credit tightness. This is something we do regularly see is this idea that it could take potentially 6 to 12 months. But take a look at this. Banking turmoil's distributional effects on rates, the evolution of the options implied skew of risks to interest rates has largely mirrored our own views, though with some differences in magnitude. On the front end, we believe the recent events significantly reduce the odds of a much higher terminal rate. Though our baseline projection is roughly about 30 bips above the markets, but the increase in probability of deep cuts is probably a little too optimistic. In other words, investors are clearly much more concerned about recessionary left tail risks, and that's why investors are pricing in all of these cuts. But the reality is the economy has been incredibly resilient. And that's where we have to get into the next pieces on how resilient the economy has been. I mean, consider what The Economist says. JP Morgan has some insight into this as well. Morgan Stanley, Citibank gives us some credit card data. We'll go through all of this quickly here. But what does The Economist tell us? The Economist, I wrote this down here because I thought it was a fantastic piece here. Uh, the Economist says the current activity index released by Goldman Sachs is steady. So even through the banking crisis, we haven't actually really seen current activity fall. The Purchasers Manager Index, which would be a leading indicator of stress at manufacturing, steady. Weekly measures of GDP, steady. Is it really maybe just that we're too early to see the recession at the moment? Well, Ipsos finds that American confidence in the economy during the banking crisis is actually growing. Maybe it's rigged, but The Economist is like, why are people so blasé? And I actually have a very interesting idea about why people are so blasé. Potentially because people are like, dude, we just went through war basically with Russia. Not only did we go through war with Russia, but we went through a pandemic. We made lots of money during the last 2 years, so we have a lot of extra stability, more stability than we previously had in 2019. That's not to say there still isn't poverty and there still aren't food insecure people, which is terrible, and the government should do something about that. But in many regards, the government as a whole is relatively incompetent. And that's like if you work for the government, I believe in you as an individual. I don't believe in the entity totally, in total. The sum of its parts are not greater than the parts itself. Anyway, so point being, yeah, I think there's actually a really good chance the reason people are so indifferent right now is because they have money to just continue to spend. And like the things that are occurring at this point, we kind of just roll our eyes to. It's just like, okay, Putin's yapping again. All right, we're over it. Another COVID variant. All right, really? Like you expect me to get like excited or agitated now? You think I'm going to go sign up for your life insurance just because you mentioned another COVID variant, Kevin? That's wishful thinking. Although I would like it if you checked out mettkevin.com/life. I think it'd be pretty cool. It's a paid promotion, but they're pretty awesome. But anyway, um, really, the resilience is very, very clear here. Now, let's look at what JP Morgan has to say about this because they have a phenomenal piece on this as well. Let's throw them up on screen here. There, one of these is the better option. I gotta label these. StreamYard lets you label these in a pretty cool way. That was the Moscow piece we covered. I can't figure it out now. That's not the best example of StreamYard right now, Kevin. You're screwing it up. There we go. So, but that's just my fault. I'm just pushing the wrong buttons. All right, here we go. So, what does JP Morgan say? Recession forecasts have been moved back modestly, and easing expectations have been brought forward. The upshot of these developments is that recession narratives built on the view of private sector fragility are being challenged. In other words, we're like stronger. I actually wrote this. I go, maybe COVID and war and as such were like a dress rehearsal for hard times ahead, right? But anyway, JP Morgan says the private sector fragility, in other words, the weakness of the private sector, the idea that private sector is weak is really being challenged, and that downbeat near-term economic forecasts are becoming far more reliant on the emergence of disruptive financial market developments. In other words, everybody's paying so much attention to this banking crisis, but the reality is it's just sort of a bearish excuse in terms of, well, the economy is still doing well, so what are the bears going to talk about? How about a banking crisis? Now, in fairness, we did just have a banking crisis, but whoops, it wasn't that big of a deal. There was actually a piece from a Goldman Sachs trader. I didn't save it here. Actually, I saved it on my iPad. Let me just read this to you really quick. I thought this was really interesting. Bull case for tech. If the leading crunch because of this credit crisis is only 25 to 50 basis points to GDP. Secular growth technology companies benefit from growth scarcity. Okay, in English, the Goldman, who is this? This is Goldman Sachs Equity Observations. I'm trying to see who wrote this. Let me go to the end of it. I don't think it really matters, but it's a Goldman Sachs analyst is basically saying, look, if the credit crisis squeezes the economy by 25 to 50 bips, it probably actually benefits big tech because they could actually hold up their numbers to the pain of smaller technology companies. And they'll be able to more appropriately leverage the gains of artificial intelligence. Now, there are risks that we continue to face some form of wage price spiral and increasing labor costs. But if those risks go away, there is actually a very clear bull case for tech as the economy continues to be so resilient, especially since global GDP is still on track for 3.7% annualized gains. The US is on track for 3.3% annualized gains of GDP this quarter. That's phenomenal. That's not even below trend growth. Below trend growth would be like 1%. We're tracking at 3.3 right now. So yeah, maybe it's coming. Maybe the pain is coming, but current strength has been very, very well strong. Now, JP Morgan doesn't actually think that current strength is going to stay. JP Morgan thinks we are going to end up in a recession towards the end of the year. JP Morgan suggests we've had some upsized surprises on retail sales. And I thought this was really incredible. Listen to this. Even though JP Morgan is convinced we're going to see a recession, look what they wrote here. The gain from real consumption did not come from a drawdown in savings, as strong gains in the labor market and reduced energy prices actually helped support real disposable income growth at an average annualized rate of 6.5% over the past 2 quarters. So even though corporate profits may be moderating, they're far from falling the way a lot of people expected, and profit margins remain stable, which really aligns with what we've seen with this idea from Goldman that big tech could actually win in this. Pricing power style stocks could win in this. We talked about non-bank lenders as well. Well, actually, we didn't talk about non-bank lenders. We talked about small banks being a little bit more sort of like, maybe if they're going from wearing like a bathing suit to going to wearing a bikini and a thong, like they got to turn up the sex appeal a little bit. We expect that to happen. But there are also non-bank lenders, whether that's private money, whether that's direct lenders for mortgages. They're the ones who usually have easy credit for you. So this idea about significant stress in the financial system. We're just not seeing it right now. And J.P. Morgan talks a little bit about how these are not necessarily indicators that are going to push us into a recession, even though their base case is still a recession. Now, J.P. Morgan also suggests here that actually this is just sort of a reiteration of what we just talked about, so let's skip that. Let's now look at Morgan Stanley right here. So Morgan Stanley had a piece on tighter credit, and then I want to look at credit card data from Citi. Credit shocks take a toll on the economy, but they take time to build. Tightening credit conditions should drag down global growth in the second half of the year. An additional loan growth deceleration will potentially pressure GDP by, oh my lord, a third of a percent, or I'm sorry, 10 basis points. Really, Morgan Stanley? You think tighter lending standards are going to affect a GDP growth in the fourth quarter by 10 bips? Nobody cares. Like, this is so minor. Even these estimates and Morgan Stanley is being a bear in this piece, they're not that big of a deal. Our banking analysts see a meaningful increase in funding costs ahead, so you haven't yet seen them, which will likely lead to tighter lending standards, slower loan growth, and wider loan spreads than previously expected. The stage is now set for an even sharper deceleration in credit growth over the course of the year. This is the base case, right? That we're going to see a loan slowdown potentially of 11% by the fourth quarter of 2023 compared to the fourth quarter of 2022. I'm sorry. This is down from 11% in the fourth quarter. The bear case would bring us to 2% loan growth at the end of 2023, compared with a baseline of 4% loan growth. So, in other words, Morgan Stanley saying things are so bad, loan growth will only be 2% at the end of the year, whereas we want it to be 4%. Even the bears are starting to sound a little weak here. Within GDP, the impact to consumption and business investment is roughly equal. They say a quicker resolution. Oh, look at this. They actually hedge their bearishness. They say risks around the outlook are large and two-sided. A quicker resolution of financial system troubles could see the economy remain on solid footing. Yes, in line with recent payroll prints. On the other hand, a more nonlinear tightening of financial conditions from here on could see larger and more rapid deteriorations of growth in the labor market. Yeah, if we see more tight loan growth, but we're not sure that we're actually going to see this. Everybody's talking about it, but as Nat West told us last week, the short-term indications are far and few between that we're actually seeing any kind of credit stress. The biggest irony is going to be that if we end up going through this cycle and everybody's talking about recession, everybody's talking about this credit stress, and it just never ends up happening. So then we have here, all told, they see a negative 1 percentage point shock to real GDP. A negative 1 percentage point shock to credit growth ends up decreasing real GDP by 20 bips. Okay, so if you're 2% below trend, so you're 40% lower or 40 basis points lower on GDP, it's relatively a nominal impact. So Morgan Stanley does go a little bit further on, and then I want to look at credit card data with you all. So at this time, our estimates lean heavily on the variation of data in the 1980s and 90s, a time when the banking sector was more prevalent in terms of a source of financing. Today, bank lending only accounts for 1/3 of all private non-credit relative to 50% in the 1980s. Okay, let me translate that to English for a moment. So in English, and this relates to what we talked about at the beginning of the video. Come here, Jack. In English, today we are 20 percentage points less reliant on big banks for lending than we were. Careful with the cable there. Than we were in the 1980s, the last time we actually had to worry about credit shocks. What's up, dude? Did you just wake up? You want to come say hi to everyone? Awesome. So anyway, really, this is not that big of a deal. In comparison, a 100 basis point increase of the Fed funds rate lowers growth by around 40 basis points. That's fine. So really, even Morgan Stanley here, a bear, is hedging this idea that maybe it's not going to be as terribly as expected. So these right here are impacts on GDP. Okay, let's go to the, let me see if there's anything else that I really want to hit from this Morgan Stanley piece. They do think more potential layoffs in Q1 24. I find it interesting that we continue to see a delay of when we're actually going to see these layoffs. It just seems like it's always delay. Everything keeps getting pushed back because the economy continues to be strong. However, technically, employment is sensitive to credit tightening, but as it was during the Great Recession. But remember, the Great Recession was a global or great financial crisis. Are we actually really going through a financial crisis right now? Or are we just going through, dare I say, transitory inflation? We do not expect the actual implications for job growth to be as significant this time around, because this time is different. Given staffing shortages in the economy will likely continue to support labor hoarding this year as economic growth slows. Further, we think limited upside in labor force participation will keep the unemployment rate relatively low, somewhat offsetting the significant slowing in jobs we expect. Okay, in English, once again, before we get to credit card data, Morgan Stanley is a bear because they think we're going to have a lot of credit tightening, which will slow GDP, and you'll have low loan growth. However, they're going to hedge that by telling you the big banks don't even matter that much anymore. And maybe people will keep labor hoarding, which means people will keep having money, and we're really just going to end up spending through this recession. The biggest risk to all of this is that inflation skyrockets. If inflation skyrockets, we're screwed. Then all these problems come to a halt. Now let's quickly look at credit card data. So what do we have for credit card data? Citi's credit card data across 16 subsectors, not including spending on services. I read that and I'm like, that's stupid. Showed the weakest spending since April of 2022. Now that's great for disinflation, but potentially not that great for economic growth. So I do want to bring that up. They do talk about though that likely the disruption in the financial sector briefly led to a divot in spending. I noticed in a YouTube ad spend that it seemed like YouTube ad spend did a little bit of this during the banking crisis, that there was somewhat of a trough basically because of the banking crisis. And so it's likely that this credit card data And this weakness may be temporary because of the banking crisis, though it's something we'll want to pay attention to. I'll show you a few things in here. First, I'll show you that there was an acceleration in pet stores, up 8.5% over the prior week, and a decline in e-commerce pure play apparel, appliances, electronics, home improvement, and home furnishings. You can see the percentages on screen here. But yes, Jack, you can.
Bye,
Jack says bye. You're welcome to grab a sandwich from the refrigerator as well, the ones with Jack on it. All right. So this is an important chart over here because, in my opinion, it just shows you the trajectory and shows you, that these negative changes really are something we've seen for a while. Look, for example, at home improvement. There was really only 1 week people spent more money on home improvement, and it was Christmas of 22. Otherwise, home improvement has been negative across the board. You could see that here. You could see that electronic spending has been negative across the board, so not a surprise. You could see that pet shops and pet foods and supply positive for retail spend for the entire last, on a weekly basis, 4 months, 3.5 months. For 3.5 months, pets have been positive, not a single break in that. Appliance stores have pretty much been negative the entire time. And as a result, overall spend has declined pretty much with the exception of the week of Christmas over the last 4 months. So there is this potential idea that, yes, look at this chart here. This shows you that we could end up seeing that earnings crush that Morgan Stanley's Mike Wilson keeps talking about. But look at how this chart, how beautiful this is. This shows you normal growth in 2019. Then you get the COVID pandemic and you get this crazy V-shaped recovery here where basically retail sales fell around 10.7%. And then they started increasing. Then the stimulus money hit. When the stimulus money hit, boy, that's really when spending skyrocketed. The different rounds of stimulus, we really saw spending balloon on a weekly basis, averaged out over here by month in 2021. And now we're getting into that recessionary territory. So yes, in fairness, retail sales are going down, but it is entirely possible that the market's already priced in some form of EPS declines for some stocks. And even if, as long as inflation goes away, if we can look through some EPS declines, which are expected to show up, the market does not necessarily have to decline solely because of EPS declines, because a lot of those may end up being priced in. And we see these leading indicators from a mile away. So, very, very interesting. I'm a big fan of that. Yeah, look, I mean, for me, again, every single day, what do? I read reports on the banking crisis, on consumers, consumption, on what's going on at companies, earnings calls, and I'm trying to understand where the risks are. We've been saying for, I would say, over 6 to 8 months now, there is no wage price spiral. And the inflationary data is fantastic, but that doesn't seem to be the big concern now. Now the big concern seems to be the recession. Banking crisis briefly, but so far that's turning out to be a nothing burger. And the idea that bears are amplifying the banking crisis as a reason for why spending in EPS is going to decline more is the only reasonable argument that's left. And it is a reasonable argument. I will not say the bears do not have a point. They have a point. EPS could decline substantially more meaningfully than we expect. But so far, with labor hoarding and the reports that we're getting on earnings, things aren't looking that terrible. So I'm very, very excited for the future. I'm very optimistic. Maybe I'm too optimistic, but that's my thought. So hopefully that's very insightful for you on the banking crisis. All right. Last note here. Somebody's asking, speaking of manufacturing, did you see the Boxable video Kevin did? I was on the floor. Oh, yeah. If you haven't watched the Boxable video yet, you could watch that. I was, I made a video talking about my skepticism about Boxable, and they knew I was going to be a bear because they invited me out to Boxable after I made my bearish video, my first bearish video. And they're like, well, come to Boxable. We'll show you what we're really about. So I go there and I'm like, this is worse than I thought. I'm like, I'm not going to lie. I'm just going to tell the truth. So, I mean, is what it is, you know. This is what I think. Uh, anyway, so I got to get ready for skiing now. So thank you for being here. I really appreciate y'all. And yeah, make sure you subscribe to the Meet Kevin Report. We'll see you in the next videos. Thanks again, folks. Really appreciate you, and we'll